Whether you're focusing on business, brand, or your professional development, while you are dealing with the matters that are impacting your here and now, you also have to have your sights set for what's next. We're speaking with leaders on their personal journeys, on their stories, on how they have addressed the challenges of today while setting the stage for tomorrow. So here we go.
Okay, let's go ahead and kick this off. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining today for what is episode number 4 of Hothouse's Now to Next series. I'm John Katinsky with Hothouse, and I'm really pleased to welcome our special guest, Scott Reames, who is here to chat with us today. Scott is a longtime friend and colleague who retired last year from Nike after a 3-decade career with the company, the last 16 years of which were spent in the unique role of Nike corporate historian, something that really doesn't exist at very many companies. We're going to have a great conversation with Scott about Nike's evolution, some of the universal lessons we can all learn about what really has become one of the most valuable brands in the world. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit questions for Scott using the Q&A tab here in Zoom. We'll be selecting some of the more interesting questions to ask him towards the end of this conversation. So please chime in and let us know what you want to learn more about. So a little more about Scott. He is a third-generation footwear guy. His grandfather owned a shoe store in East St. Louis in the 1930s and worked the rest of his career at Brown Shoe Company in importing and exporting. Scott's father was a traveling shoe salesman for Brown, who later moved to Eugene, Oregon to help start the Osaga Shoe Company. Some people want their kids to grow up to become doctors or lawyers, but Scott, I think you are destined to work for a sneaker company. A little more about Scott. He graduated from University of Oregon with a degree in journalism and worked for several PR and marketing agencies before landing his first role at Nike as the marketing and PR lead for what was then the brand new Nike Town retail concept. It's hard to remember that Nike Town was sort of once a dream, and now they're all over the world. While working at Nike Town, Scott developed what would become what I kind of believe is his signature MO at Nike, which is carving out his own career path by identifying business gaps and opportunities that weren't being met within that company, and then proposing new roles to solve for them. So while working on Nike Town, he worked closely with athletes and Nike sports marketing, and he realized that Nike really needed a sports information department, much like colleges have in their athletic department, to handle the athletes, their bios, their appearances on behalf of Nike. So he actually pitched the idea to his boss and was told to just do it. Ultimately, that new department was called Athlete Relations. Scott and his team became the go-to resource for Nike sales, marketing, retail, public relations, and advertising, to secure hundreds of Nike athletes who are contractually under agreement with Nike to appear at sales meetings, ad shoots, press events, and so on. In 1997, Scott moved into PR and Nike US communications, and then eventually into a newly created position in global brand communications, where he focused on media strategies related to the brand's senior executives, earnings, shareholder meetings, and global business media. So Scott really had a front row seat to an explosive period of growth within Nike's history. During his years in PR, Scott came to appreciate probably the limits of what Nike's existing records and archives department could deliver. He felt like there was an opportunity to take Nike's archive function to a new level, where they would actually develop new stories and bring together existing content under one roof. He pitched a proposal to create the Department of Nike Archives, which he dubbed DNA, and was able to get that proposal in front of Nike co-founder and chairman Phil Knight, who supported it. And in 2005, Scott became Nike's first corporate historian. The story gets better. In 2012, Phil confided in Scott that he was planning to write a memoir and asked him to gather materials from the archive. Scott pulled together early correspondence, memos, internal documents, transcripts of interviews with some of Nike's earliest employees. It resulted in a company timeline that spanned more than 60 pages. Those materials all helped Phil Knight flesh out the framework and fill in the details that ultimately became his memoir, Shoe Dog, which was published in 2016. You don't have to be a sports fan to appreciate it's a fantastic autobiography. It's a fantastic business book. I would encourage all of you, if you haven't read it, to check it out. When Scott retired in October 2021, he was at the time directing a department of 7 writers, researchers, and curators within DNA, and they were all working to capture the important, the interesting, and the educational stories that really make Nike such a fascinating place to work. Just a little perspective here before we jump into questions. When Scott and I joined Nike in 1992, the company was generating nearly $3 billion a year in revenue. That sounds big, but it was actually still very much running like a small company. Scott, by the time you left the company in 2021, I believe the brand had soared to more than 45 billion in revenue. So it's quite a rocket ship ride that you witnessed over 3 decades. Scott, welcome, my friend, and thanks for getting up early to chat with us today from Portland.
Well, thanks for having me. And I don't know what else I can say now. You covered the whole gamut.
Nothing else to talk about.
Yeah, I'm
I
kind of
would
done
love,
here. Thanks.
I would love to start with just that unique role that you created at Nike. There's so few modern companies that would ever imagine the need for a brand historian role. How did you conceive this idea, and how did you pitch the idea for an editor of the Nike story to senior leadership?
Well, somewhat of a confluence, I guess is the word, of a couple of different things going on. One was my own observations. As you mentioned, I was doing the PR communications for the senior executives, and that included Phil Knight, Mark Parker, who would succeed Phil as CEO, and a couple of others. And I would sit in on the interviews, and I would, I'd make notes, and they're talking to Forbes or Business Week or whatever. And I just noticed every time that they would, either any of them would tell the story of how we got started, about the swoosh, about the name, et cetera, et cetera. It would change a little bit, nothing drastic. I mean, we paid $40 for the swoosh, we paid 35, we paid 75. It was, nobody seemed to have an exact number written down. And there was a book, Julie Strasser's book, Swoosh, it's an unauthorized biography of Nike, and I used it to a certain extent, but there were a few people that said, well, there's some things in there that are not right. And so I tried to write down my own notes on this thing. And then I thought, the more I started doing these interviews, the more facilitating these interviews, the more I realized most of what we do have is an oral history. There's nobody within Nike writing it down. Third parties have done, but not really within Nike. So I started formulating a plan. Talked to a friend of mine who was a designer for Nike, and he had expressed some of the similar issues, that there was, there's like the same 4 or 5 founders, if you will, who we keep getting referred back to get lessons about the early days. But he goes, there's been hundreds, if not thousands, of people that have come before us. What about their stories? So all these things swirled together in my mind, and I put together a proposal that, as you pointed out, called DNA, to take the existing archive function and add another facet of it, which would be the capturing the stories. We were capturing the things pretty nicely. We had all the Jordans, we have all these, that, and the other thing. We just didn't have the stories behind them. And if we did have the story behind them, it was like one person's recollection, or almost apocryphal, legend has it kind of thing. I'm like, well, but who actually did this? So that was essentially the impetus for putting the proposal together. And then I showed it to Nelson Ferris, who, anybody who knows Nike probably has run across Nelson. He's been there for a little over 50 years now, which is mind-boggling. And his first reaction was, "This is great. Let's take it to Phil." And I said, "No, no, 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 no. I got to run it up the flag. I got to, there's people I got to show it to." And he said, "No, let's just show it to Phil." So we went upstairs to Phil's office, and Nelson got in because he was Nelson, and we showed it to Phil, and Phil liked the idea. And a few weeks later, I got a call saying the position's been, or the head count's been approved, and was I interested in the job? And I said, "Yes, I am."
That's
That was
tremendous.
2005.
So for those who didn't know of him, Nelson was a character. He was almost like the living embodiment of Nike culture. And when new employees would come in, he was essentially the person who sort of briefed everyone on the company culture. And sort of day one, you were embodied in everything that the company was about.
Right.
So for folks who aren't familiar, I think few people realize just how precarious the early years of Nike were. It was originally launched as Blue Ribbon Sports. There are lots of myths around those early years. Can you give us sort of your abbreviated historian's version of that Nike origin story? Because it's really interesting.
Sure. Abbreviation's not my strength, so I will do my best. And feel free to go cut. So essentially, it comes down to two partners. Bill Bowerman was the head track coach at the University of Oregon, starting in the late 40s until 1973. And Phil Knight ran for him in the mid to late 50s as usually ran a mile distance. So they became friends. And I mean, it was a complicated relationship because he was the coach, but they did become friends later. So anyway, Phil was what he calls himself, I think, a hamburger. What Bill Bowerman called him was hamburger. He's kind of like he was a good runner, but not elite, right? So Phil said that's one reason why Bill would give him shoes to wear that Bill was working on tinkering with, because he wasn't going to risk hurting one of his star athletes. And those are Phil's words. And Bill had been spending most of the 50s with ideas on how to make better shoes, but he couldn't get any of the leading designers like Adidas or Puma, not designers, but footwear manufacturers to listen to his ideas. He would write them and they'd write back saying, well, here's where you can get your shoes and thank you. And they would never listen to him. So he wanted to get access to a manufacturer that would incorporate some of the ideas he had for making a better running shoe. So when Phil graduated from first University of Oregon and then Stanford, where he got his business degree, he had written a paper for an entrepreneur class at Stanford that posited that you could make shoes in Japan at that time that would be as good as or even better than, but less expensive than the German models being made by Adidas and Puma, which was essentially the same premise that the way cameras were being made at that time. So his genius was that shoes, cameras, didn't really matter. Whatever you're making in Japan could be done as good as or better. So that was the basis of the relationship, and I mean of his idea. And when he graduated, he wanted to put that into motion. So he meets with Onitsuka Tiger brand. It's a running shoe made in Kobe, Japan. And he convinces them to make them the Western 13 states, I think, distributor for Tiger in the United States. So he's coming from that aspect, and he goes to Bill as his old coach, and he basically wants an endorsement. He wants to sell some shoes to Bill, be able to say the University of Oregon, which had just won an NCAA title the year before, wears Tiger shoes, right? So he's just looking for an endorsement, and not knowing this whole backstory with Bill wanting to have access to a manufacturer. So Bill gets the shoes that Phil sends him and immediately writes back and says, not only will I buy you some shoes, but if you cut your old coach in on this, so we can make a partnership, which blew Phil away. That's not what he was looking for. So that's somewhat the origin story. I mean, you've got Bill, who now has a conduit, now has access to a footwear manufacturer, and his ideas are now being listened to and being sent to, and this would become the Cortez and would become other models that are now famous, because Phil, that this was now a point of connection. And of course, Phil's thrilled because he's got his old coach now with that endorsement and with that involvement. So it was really one of those, I don't want to say it was serendipitous, but it was definitely fortunate that they both had these two backgrounds that melded and matched so well. And that became the foundation for the partnership that lasted until Bill's death in 1999.
Tremendous. And the waffle iron, myth or fact?
Oh no, it's quite real. And I mean, that was one of the funnier stories of my first days as historian was I talked to Barbara, because Bill had already passed, and Barbara was Bill's wife, and she's lovely. She was to mid-90s. I mean, she was sharp as a tack. And I asked her one day, because people ask me all the time, well, do you have the original waffle iron? What happened to the original waffle iron? So I asked Barbara, and she goes, oh, I threw that away, and she goes, Bill glued it shut, and it was a wedding gift we'd had since the 30s, and it was useless because he glued it shut. He didn't put a releasing agent on the thing when he first tried to tinker with the idea. So she laughed, and I just was like, well, why wouldn't, again, we have the benefit of hindsight now. In 1970 or 71, they weren't thinking this could be the preeminent, design idea for footwear of the 1970s. Let's hold on to this waffle iron. So she threw it away. Well, I never thought to ask her, well, where did you throw it away? And that mattered, because they lived way above Eugene on a hill, small mountains, large hill overlooking the Mackenzie River. And it was a bunch of switchbacks just to get up to their property. So they didn't have garbage trucks that would come by and pick up trash. They usually either burnt what they could burn, or they buried what they couldn't burn, and that's where it was. It was essentially thrown into a rubbish pit in the back, and then once each rubbish pit would be filled up, they covered it with dirt and forget about it, move on to the next one, and it stayed there from 1971 until about 2000. I think it was 10 when I got the call from one of their family members saying that they had been working to expand the carport where Bill had done a lot of his tinkering on shoes, and when they had a cat or like a little backhoe or whatever, and they did a big scoop, and all this stuff fell out, including old shoes and this really old rusty waffle iron.
I
They
love
showed
it.
it to Barbara, and Barbara said, "That's it. That was the original one." So I was like, when I got that call, I was seriously, I almost just like looked at the phone like, "Are you kidding me?" And it's and then so we worked out a deal where we made a donation to a track program that the family was involved in, and then they gave us all the things that they found in that hole, and so that was the original waffle iron is now in the Nike archives.
It's like being an archaeologist. So you're a self-trained historian, and here you are in this big company. What were some of the challenges you faced as you kind of created your own research and your methodology for Nike? How did you have to get people to buy into it? How did you separate fact from fiction?
Well, the first thing, honestly, is that'll think about, don't swallow the waterfall, right? I mean, it was like, where do we go first? What do we do the history of golf? Do we do running? Do we tennis? I mean, it was like we could, and by we, I mean me, right? I didn't have a staff of 7 back then. I had a staff of me, and of course, you get tempted to say, well, let's start with the oldest first because they're the most at risk, right? I mean, you want to talk to Phil Knight. You want to talk to Jeff Hollister, Jeff Johnson, some of the founding generation of the company. And of course, as I said, by 2005, when I started the role, Mr. Bowerman had passed away in '99, so I wasn't able to talk to him. Rob Strasser had passed away in '93, so it didn't, and he was in his, I think, 40s when he died. So it isn't even accurate to say we'll talk to the oldest people first because they're most at risk. So that was part of it, was trying to put a cohesive plan together and not try to solve everything at one time, but work your way forward in a methodical and yet critically thought way. And then the other thing, John, was there was so much misinformation, right? I mean, I just early on in my doing my own research, I used a couple of different timelines that existed that were created, I think, by HR and by a couple other groups back in the 80s. There was one, I think, done in 1982 that was in an internal newsletter that I found a copy of, and celebrating the 10th anniversary of the company. And I looked at it, and just my rudimentary knowledge of Nike history, I'm like, well, that's not right. That's not right. That's not right. So I was thinking, I mean, it's like little silly things, like Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman first met in 1957. No, they didn't. They met in 55, right? I mean, little things like that. And I thought, well, this was done 10 years after the company started, and Phil was probably just down the hall. Why didn't somebody go, hey, Phil, what year did you meet Bill? 55? And, oh, that's right. So I was a little concerned because these were somewhat of the bedrocks that I wanted to build on. And I wasn't convinced that whoever had done the original research had really done the real research properly. So I had to that timeline you mentioned, I literally created that from scratch. Nothing went on into that Word document. So it originally was, now it's on an internal site, but it was originally a Word document, and nothing was added there until I could corroborate it with as reliable a source as I could possibly find. And over time, that's when we started realizing that we had done not a great job. And just all the people who captured the stories before had somewhat relied upon earlier bad data, right? So it was like the next iteration of a timeline repeated the mistakes from the first couple of timelines, and almost to the point where it's like I had a hard time convincing people that the dates that or things that they're telling me were not true, right? That actually didn't happen then.
It is literally like being a detective. I want to pivot a little bit to Phil Knight. Big companies, some of them are intricately tied to their founders, and some are not. Phil is generally recognized as a legendary business leader. He's an iconoclast. When I first joined Nike, one of the first things that resonated with me, besides the sweet employee discounts, was just how fast and fearlessly the company made these fully committed decisions to pursue new opportunities, whether even in categories they hadn't competed in before. Phil had a lot of lines and mantras that became part of company culture, but changes our business was something he embodied. This series is called Now to Next, and it always has felt to me that Nike was always kind of looking at what's next for them. Can you give us your sense of Phil Knight as a man and what really makes him unique as a business leader?
Sure, and I was lucky enough to work more closely with him than others, perhaps just because of the sheer. It's just important that the CEO and the founder I be connected to him, right? And he fully embraced that, so that was fortuitous for me. But yeah, so I observed him quite a bit, and he's a complicated person, right? I mean, it's simple in some ways, and he's like a huge sports fan, a huge believer in competition. Nike is a very competitive company, and I think it's very much a reflection of the co-founder. Bill was less. Bill was really had an impact on the design community, but because he was on the board and wasn't really as front and center, his role, I think, was more related to imprinting on the designers, because they basically revere Bill Bowerman as like the headwater of all design. But Phil was more of the spirit of the competition, the self deprecation, irreverence. I mean, he loves a good prank. He's kind of impish in some ways, but he's also just whip smart, right? So when I brought the DNA proposal to him, I'm not kidding you, John. He looks at it and he said, "Well, this is good, but this is more than one person. This is going to require like a staff of six or eight people and a budget of $2 million or $3 million." And I just coughed. I was like, "Yeah, well, sure." And he goes, and then he said, "And you're not going to get that." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Well, let me think about it." And so as you mentioned, when I retired 15 years later, I had a staff of 7 people. So he was spot on that. I didn't have a budget of $2.5 million, sadly, but so I mean, he has a way of just processing these things, and not that he's a crystal ball guy, because we've certainly made mistakes over the years, but he just seems to process and roll things out, and damn, a lot of stuff he thinks doesn't come to fruition, right? I mean, we could go into a bunch of different rabbit holes, but like Tiger Woods or Michael Jordan. I mean, some of those. They were known to be good players or good athletes, but he took a chance on a time, especially in '96, we had not great golf product, and he signs the guy who's potentially going to be the world's greatest golfer. We didn't have great soccer product, and we signed Brazil. This is right around at the same time. So he's basically willing and or forcing the company to meet the level of the athletes that we've worked with or the teams that we've signed. And how do you talk Brazil and some of the other things into coming with a company that soccer product was pedestrian at best? I mean, it was okay. I mean, I would love to have been in my old role back then, because I would love to sit down with them right at that point and say, "Really, Brazil? We're going to be able to make product that meets their needs?" But we did. I mean, it was.
As a soccer player, I remember those days, because I could barely wear the boots for my amateur games, and here we were expecting the best national team in the world to put them on. It's really kind of a fearlessness in terms of kind of putting the line in the sand and deciding that you're going to meet that expectation.
Right. And it's calculated risks, right? I mean, he's a risk taker, but he's not like a foolish risk taker. We've pretty rarely just walked into something like, "Wow, we really blew that." I mean, like golf clubs, that was a tough business to get into, and we ultimately decided that equipment was just not something. We either had to be like fully invested, and there was just not that appetite for it. So we backed out and got out of it. So certainly Nike doesn't have a batting average of 1,000, but the mistakes are much more rare than the home runs.
So speaking of those mistakes, Phil, I think once said the trouble in America is not that we're making too many mistakes, but we make too few. Risk taking is really just sort of in the company's DNA. We all tend to think of these iconic brands like Nike as being infallible, and that everything they touch turns to gold. But I know there are some examples of risk-taking moments or controversies that could have gone either way. Can you share some of those and how the brand responded to them to become more resilient?
Sure. I can go with one, like a product example in the 90s. A lot of people, even if they're not really been in sports that much, perhaps remember Michael Johnson in the 96 Olympics. He was running the 200 and the 400 meters, which is already difficult to do in one Olympics. And he was considered to be the favorite. So, he certainly lived up to it. Spoiler alert. But he wore gold shoes, right? Gold Nike shoes. And this is also a good example of what I found early in my historian days. Was that story was told a lot, because it's a great story. It's very successful. It makes Nike look fantastic, right? I mean, the world's greatest athlete or runner runs in gold shoes, wins gold, sets a world record. Oh my God, isn't Nike brilliant? Kind of thing. But the story about how the gold shoes came about, to me, is a way more educational, way more interesting. And that started with what Phil Knight called one of the worst examples of Nike failing an athlete at the highest level. And that was in Stuttgart in 1993 at the World Championships. There was a runner named Quincy Watts, who was one of the best in the world. And he was coming around the last turn. I think it was on a 400 meter. Must have been if it was turns. And one of his shoes delaminated to the point where it was flapping, and the upper and the outsole were no longer connected. And so it's hard to run when you have that happen to you. And so he ended up going from first, and I don't think he even medaled it. And immediately it was like, what happened, right? And so they discovered that the shoes had been kept in the back of a car. It had been hot, so the glues had come loose, and then with the pounding of a runner at that speed, it just over time on the track, it just came apart. And Phil said that was unacceptable. We cannot let an athlete down like that. So nobody was fired. Nobody was. Basically, a lot of people said, how did this happen? And they researched what happened, and they decided to reorganize and create an elite team of people that would do nothing but create product for Olympians and the highest level competitors and other sports. And that team is what, over the next 2.5 years, led to the decision to create the gold shoe and then working with Michael Johnson. So again, it's not really fair to tell new employees about the gold shoe, because that just makes it sound like, it's just easy to be super intelligent and create amazing things. It's not. And that actually came from probably the nadir of Nike design by letting somebody down at the World Championship Games. So that's one of the stories I really enjoy telling to new employees, especially because it not only humanizes the company more and the designers more, but it also is a great lesson. It's timeless, whether it happened in 1996 or 93, or today. So that's another. Sorry, you were going.
No, it's yeah, I that was something that I remember. I was at the Olympic finals when Michael Johnson won those events wearing those gold shoes, and I couldn't help but think about how that could have blown up in their face if he hadn't performed, if the shoes hadn't performed. And there's just a lot of courage and belief to make that happen. On a more recent basis, in terms of controversy, can you talk a little bit about Colin Kaepernick and how Nike sort of embraced him as an athlete and took a stand on that issue?
Yeah, and that was, I think, 2019. So, pre-COVID. Remember when the world didn't have COVID? So, yeah, that was it was a very, again, one of those calculated risks, right? I don't think people within the company who really have a connection to our core audience, our core consumer, I don't think they really felt it was that big of a risk, because, and as it turned out, they were mostly correct. We got a lot of controversy. There was certainly a lot of people not unhappy with us, but they were far from the demographic that we focus on, right? There were a lot of people my age, and burning their shoes, and they were all saying that, and pundits on TV were like, Nike's shot itself in the foot and Nike's made a huge mistake. From their point of view, they had, but from the 15 to 25-year-old consumer, we got just a ton of feedback saying, thank you for doing this. You know, we stand with you all, you know, and that was, I think, not a surprise. At least it shouldn't have been a surprise to the brand folks, because this is what they do. They need to, they know who Nike is and what Nike stands for, and they know how that resonates with the people that we need to and want to resonate with. So it was, I don't know really, I don't know how to, it's only been 3 years, right? So it's, or 4 years now. So it's hard to really put it in its overall history. You know, is that going to be a blip? Will people remember that as a seminal moment? It's like right now we're going through with the trans influencer is now creating a bunch of controversy for Bud Light, and there's some for Nike. You know, how will that be judged years from now? It's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, I think it's you know, people will look at the brand and you know, knowing who your consumer is and did they stand up for the consumer that they are married to. And Nike, to your point, it serves a lot of consumers, but I think the ethos and the culture is grounded in sort of a certain age and a certain mindset consumer, and that's kind of the bullseye. I'm gonna pivot a little bit to some questions from our participants here. Someone asked, how did the culture of Nike evolve from the early days to when you retired? You know, how did you see that culture change, and how did you capture it from a Nike DNA standpoint?
That's a good question. And it was one of the biggest challenges, right? I mean, you can't have the same corporate culture, and people didn't like my answer when I would say this. The company cannot be 72 or 74 or whatever thousand people in 100 and some odd different countries and have the exact same culture as a room full of what they used to call butt faces. You know, the senior executives were like 6 or 8 of them in a room in Tigard or in Beaverton, and they would just routinely, like every 6 or 8 months, they would rotate like a little carousel, and all of a sudden the director of apparel is now the director of you know, footwear. The director of footwear is now the marketing director. And they did that with regularity, and they all just pissed and moaned and argued and celebrated together. That's a way different culture. I mean, can you imagine right now if you got a memo and it said all of the senior level people at all the different VPs are now moving over one step, and now the VP of logistics is now VP of you know, tennis marketing. I mean, so that, I mean, that's an extreme example, but the culture hasn't changed a lot in its central core, right? I mean, it's still very much a collaborative company. It's still, this is ebbed and flowed depending on who the senior leadership positions, but you're still able for the most part to challenge, to come back and say, I don't know if that's such a good idea, instead of just, you know, basically, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, you know, we'll do what you say. And you know, like you pointed out with my role, I mean, I had 4 essentially main jobs within the company over 30 years, and 2 of them came about just because I thought I had a good idea and somebody listened, you know, as opposed to like, well, we'll run that by consultants, or we'll, you know, we don't need to do that. And so there's always been that willingness to go back to, I should start with this, my bad. There was the 1977 print ad that just had 5 words in it: there is no finish line. Right? It is probably, in my mind, more central to the essence of Nike's psyche, if you will, than just do it or anything else. It is this relentless belief and self-challenge that, yeah, you did well. That event kicked ass. You ran that race and it was amazing. But next time you could probably do it a little better, right? You could run a little faster. The meeting could be a little more efficient. The product could be a little bit better. It's not that Nike people aren't satisfied and don't get pleasure from what they do, but there is this sense, it's like, that was good. Next time, let's be a little better. And it's not drummed into us. People don't have tattoos, at least I don't know if they do, of that, but it's definitely permeates the mindset, I think, of at least of the employees that have been there a long time, and I think that are stars. I think they're the ones that are not satisfied with, hey, look what I did. No, that's very not a Nike thing to do or say.
No, it's a competitive, restless culture in mostly in all the good ways. Going back to there is no finish line, you kind of teed up my next question. That client agency relationship between Nike and Wieden+Kennedy, it dates back to 1982 when Dan and David left a small agency, William Kane, to start their own agency, and they persuaded Nike to come along as their first client. That grew into a 40-year relationship that would really change advertising history. All of us who work in the business, we're completely envious of that relationship because it's the way we want our client relationships to work. Sadly, Dan Wieden passed away last year, but what can you tell us about that client agency relationship? What was so rare about it and what made it so special?
Well, in the 1990s, when I was in the PR department, US PR, one of my roles, because we all had various things that we would specialize on, one of mine was advertising, right? So I went to a lot of advertising meetings, mostly to observe and occasionally to interject and say, "Are you sure you want to do that?" From a PR standpoint, like, "Are you sure?" And I was struck by, in these conference rooms, whether they were down at Wieden+Kennedy's office or on the Nike campus, I couldn't tell you who were the Nike employees and who were the Wieden folks, the way they talked to each other. It was just so, there was clearly such a seamless group, and ideas were shared back and forth. And it was really remarkable. And sometimes I wouldn't have to say, "No, excuse me, you're with Wieden," right? And then sometimes they'd stop, they'd introduce and tell me what their roles were. But it was amazing that there was this absolute symbiotic relationship. And as I got to know them better, I would find out that a lot of them actually went on vacations together, and they went out bar hopping together. And it was really, it was more than just a client and an agency relationship. And I think I was, certainly having them be based in Portland was beneficial. And having Dan Wieden, Phil both went to University of Oregon. Not that that gives you, there's some like the water in Eugene, but there was a similar mindset. I think if I remember correctly, Dan on his desk had a sign that said "Fail harder," right? So it was again that willingness to make a mistake, and Phil would say the same thing. It's okay to make mistakes, just don't make the same one twice, and don't cover it up, right? So in other words, learn from it. And he and Dan both share that, and Dave to a lesser. I didn't know Dave as well because he retired. Dave Kennedy.
He dropped out a little bit earlier.
Yeah, and then of course he passed away a year before Dan did, so that was a terrible 1-2 punch. But for example, so yeah, when I can tell you when they had I don't know what we call it, memorial, they had a celebration at Wieden+Kennedy. Oh, this is several months ago, and they were celebrating Dan and Dave because David passed away way deeper into the COVID mire, so that nobody wanted to get together. And Wieden+Kennedy sent out an invitation to every employee who ever worked there to come, and they were all welcome. And I think close to 2,000 of them did, from all over the world. And they invited a bunch of people from Nike, current Nike executives, long time ago Nike executives. I got an invitation, thankfully. I was pretty excited about that. And it was just an amazing evening. And again, the same thing. You would see Nike executives talking with them, Wieden+Kennedy people, and it was all like one big family. It was definitely not a vibe of an agency and a client. And I think that trust and that partnership certainly went a long way towards generating some of the most amazing ads that literally have ever been made.
Speaking of those ads, I have another question from our audience here. Can you tell us a little bit about how the Bo Knows campaign came into being?
Sure. It's actually this is one of those like inside Nike things. So Bo Jackson was actually part of the original Just Do It campaign in 1988. He was in 3 different ads. One was called Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And not surprisingly, on each of those ads, he was doing a different sport. So the idea, the groundwork was being laid for the multi-sport cross-training athlete. And that led to, when cross-training was essentially starting to really take off, that led to the 1989 ad campaign. And that was, again, because Bo was this amazing athlete who could excel in baseball and in football, which just was very rare and still is, really, when you think about it. So he was like the perfect athlete to embody the cross-training mindset. And I met him once, a long time ago. So I didn't really have a chance to talk to him about, did he actually have a love for a bunch of different sports? But it was a whimsical ad, they bring in Gretzky and, and he just goes, no, he doesn't play hockey, and then you get Bo Diddley. And again, this is one of those Wieden+Kennedy, just how do you guys come up with this stuff? And then they just bring it together in such a way that it's so memorable. And then one of the Nike executives, I believe Mark Thomashow, you probably remember Mark.
Yep.
It was his idea, I believe, to have there be an update when all of a sudden Bo does know Diddley, right? So a few months later, he's out, he's playing guitar, which I think was probably a little magic of television editing. But again, it's a little bit, there was no finish line there too, right? You do Bo knows, that's amazing. Oh, and then sometimes luck plays a hand. They debut the ad during the 1989 All-Star game.
Yeah.
And Bo decides that during that game he's going to hit a home run and drive in, like I think 3 or whatever, and becomes an MVP. And oh, by the way, in the 4th inning, we debut Bo knows, right? So sometimes being lucky is also as important as being, setting yourself up for success. But luck certainly can be helpful.
Yeah, and for a little more insider baseball, Nike is really known for having topical spots ready to run depending on outcomes of certain events, and it's planned spontaneity in the sense that there's some risk taking there. But if you can celebrate an athlete who's won a championship and you've got that ready to go, and you don't run it if they don't win, but when they do, it makes everybody look like heroes. And it's just always fascinated me, the methods that would go to sort of making that magic happen. Speaking of magic, I did watch the new film Air last night. You've probably screened it multiple times in the past week and a half, probably with some of our former colleagues. As a movie, I was thoroughly entertained by it. For those of you who haven't seen it yet, it's a fictionalized version, directed by Ben Affleck, and who also stars in it with Matt Damon and a lot of other great actors, about the pursuit of a game-changing partnership between who was then a rookie Michael Jordan and Nike's fledgling basketball division. It's hard to believe that once upon a time, Nike was a distant third behind Adidas and Converse as a basketball brand. It ultimately led to the creation of the Air Jordan brand. I'm assuming that you've got your thumbs up or thumbs down in your mind, but with your colleagues and having talked about this, what do you think they got right and what did they get wrong?
Well, I depending on which hat I'm wearing. If I'm just Joe going to a movie guy, it's a thumbs up. If I'm Nike's historian, it's like, what were you thinking? So. And I was nervous from the get-go when I first saw the trailer, and it very, very clearly at the starts hawks it as inspired by true events, right? So like, what does that mean, right? It's not even it doesn't say based on a true story. It goes inspired by true events. And so that made me a little nervous. And then when I started talking to people within the company to find out who from Nike was a consultant or who helped them, and found no one, including myself, including my old department, including most of the people being portrayed in the movie, had been contacted. I was like, okay, now I'm really getting nervous. So I did go to the premiere. I went to advanced screening before it went broad or wide on the 5th. And there was Howard White and a few people that were with the company at the time. And again, it was entertaining, but I was just scratching my head I was like, what? I don't think that's, wait, no, that didn't happen, or that didn't happen that way. And that's, I guess, I'm being like completely a buzzkill about this. What I would tell anybody who has seen the movie or who intends to see the movie, what it gets right, and this is what I've been told by a number of people, because I didn't work for Nike in 1984, it gets the vibe, it gets the feeling of the office, it gets the look of the office, very accurate. So a lot of people were tickled at how much that turned out to be pretty accurate. What it gets wrong, and this is to me one of the biggest flaws in it, is most of what they portray in the movie, that if it did happen, it was done by Rob Strasser and Peter Moore, who was the creative director. Rob was the marketing director and Peter was the creative director. Sonny Vaccaro, who is the Matt Damon role and is essentially the star role in this whole thing, his main contribution to the whole Jordan saga was to be an advocate that we should sign Michael Jordan. And he was very dogged about it. He was insistent that we sign Michael Jordan. But from that point forward, he didn't have anything to do with the design of the shoe. He didn't have anything to do with the contract. That whole scene where see, now I'm going to be a spoiler. It's just, again, when you're watching the movie, it's mostly Rob Strasser. He was the marketing director. He negotiates contracts. He would be the one who would ultimately decide the coloring and how the shoe would be marketed. Sonny was a basketball sports marketing person. It would not be in his purview. And I'm not just doing that on my own belief. I've interviewed, I mean, as you can imagine, Jordan, the signing of Jordan is a critical moment in Nike history. We've done, my old department and we did an extensive amount of research and interviewed as many of the people, except for Rob, because he passed away in 93, but we've got his widows. We talked to her, and we've also got the book that she wrote. And the only person that we've never agreed to sit down with us was Sonny Vaccaro. We invited him several times to talk with us, and he never responded. So I'm frustrated there because I would have loved to have gotten his point of view, but he didn't.
Yeah, he's actually a very polarizing character in Nike's history. He definitely knew his basketball, but this is probably an example of Hollywood sort of reimagining events to suit them. The one thing that came sort of through loud and clear to me is just that notion of risk-taking and resilience that I do feel the film got right. Risk-taking is just, I've never seen a client or a brand that has courageously taken risks like I witnessed at Nike. With that in mind, based on your experience at Nike, what kind of team-based approach do you think works best in helping businesses take risks?
Well, you have to have, I mean, it sounds like 101, but you have to have the ability and the belief that risks are acceptable, right? I mean, there was a long time Nike communications PR person. It was a high level role, and everything was like, the sky is falling. We can't do that. Oh, that's too risky. That's too risky. And I remember one time, I won't say his name because he's a lovely person, but he's never seemed to really connect. And I was like, we're Nike, right? We're not a soap company. We're not a detergent company. It's okay. We're involved with athletes like John McEnroe, right? I mean, you cannot be serious, having tantrums, and that does turn some people off, but there's Serena. I mean, there's a lot of athletes that we work with that are controversial, and if you aren't willing to be in fully, then you're in the wrong business, right? And so, I think as a team, you have to understand that there's going to be an ebb and flow. There's going to be some decisions made that you're like, ooh, that was hopefully an unintended or unseen consequence. I mean, you shouldn't make mistakes that you could have seen. That's not good, right? That's where I think Phil was so good about being able to look well past the day and think what was going to happen. And to a certain extent, there was a number of successful executives within the company who have that same mindset. And so a lot of it is knowing I'm sort of getting too esoteric with your question, but a lot of it is the mind, knowing who you are, knowing who your brand is, being authentic to it. I mean, authenticity is used a lot, and that's probably why I bristle over the movie a little bit. There's so much that was inauthentic about it. But authenticity is very important at Nike. That we've had maxims, we've had there's in the movie there's these 10 principles which did exist, not nearly to the high level. Those. Yeah, they were not vaunted like scripture like they seem to be in the movie, and they were not done by Phil Knight. They were done by Rob Strasser. Again, Rob Strasser. Remember that name. But those principles in some form have existed since the late 70s. But an authenticity, whether it's used in that particular exactly that word or that mindset, is woven through all the different attempts to crystallize and to understand what Nike stands for. So that, to me, the authenticity is what makes the brand resonate, right? People know who you are, and I hate to even get down the whole labor thing because that can take a whole, like be another hour and a half on that. But I do remember when I was in the PR department in the late 90s, where Nike made its products overseas and was very controversial. It still is to a certain extent today, but one of the leading, I think he's still in the business, Matt Powell, one of the guys who has covered Nike from a business standpoint forever, said to me, he goes, Nike is in this unusual position where people are not happy with Nike about things that they're not, but they don't leave. They're just like, do better. Come on, you guys. I mean, they and the attitudes seem to be that way. It's like, we're not happy that this is happening. You guys have got to do better. You can't. But they would stop short of, I'm never buying you again. I mean, some people will boycott and they'll make that, but that was his point of view. And I was like startled by it a little way. How do you feel connected to a brand that you don't really even know the people? I know people don't know. Very few people met Phil Knight or me or anybody else or you, but yet they embody they almost give the body I mean, they give Nike a body, like it's a person.
Yeah, I think the brand kind of has engendered a certain amount of goodwill and trust and faith, to where people are going to give it a chance to do better and to fix mistakes. And I think people are impressed with how the brand sort of listens to its audience and reacts to it. We spent a lot of time talking about Nike's past today, and this series is called Now to Next. And you've been a historian there. You've watched this growth, and there's the whole notion of if you don't learn history, you're doomed to repeat it. But the history that you've sort of chronicled at Nike probably has some teachable moments. So, as someone who's spent 30 years observing this unbelievable growth spurt, what are some of the universal lessons that you can take away that marketers, because most of us on this call today are marketers and agency people, what can we take that we can apply to the future of growing brands?
Okay. Well, there's a couple of things I can think of off the top of my head. So one of the things that I hope most companies do, whether they've been around for 150 years like Levi Strauss or 50 like Nike or 20 or 10, is that you do respect and draw from your past. Companies like Apple, I've heard, Steve Jobs, I think at one point he said they don't need an archive, and I get that to a certain extent, right? The iPhone 37 or whatever we're up to now isn't really informed by the 2 or the 3 or the 5, right? It's not like, I get that to a certain extent, but I think that again, I've only been historian for one company, but I can tell you that the history is it's a drawing point. It's people are thrilled to be a part of that continuum. They love to know the stories. And so I think companies that don't draw from their past and again, not just draw like, oh, another thing we used to do. And let me give you an example there. So the first Air shoe, the Tailwind, came out late 78 and then wide release in 79. And there was a lot of work to try to figure out how to get a tiny little plastic airbag in the heel of a shoe without bursting it, perturbing it. It was not, because the way the shoes were made back then, it was not conducive to putting something in the heel. So they spent an inordinate amount of time working on getting that to happen, and they were finally successful. So the shoe is about ready to get to market. At the very last minute, whoever made these decisions, probably Rob Strasser, said change the color of the shoe. So this Jeff Johnson is telling me the story, and Jeff Johnson was Nike's very first full-time employee, and he's one that came up with the name Nike. He's an amazing human being, and I'm very thankful he's still alive, and I wish he would write a book and have a movie. But anyway, so they were working on. So Jeff tells me this whole story. And he said when they changed the shoe color, it required a different type of paint, which I didn't realize they even used paint to paint the mesh of the upper. Well, the paint was metallic silver, and it had actually little bits of metal in it, little tiny bits that were big enough to, when the mesh would rub, it would abrade and the mesh would rip out. So the shoe almost was a disaster, not because of the airbag that they spent so much time and effort because they made a capricious decision at the last minute to change the color. And so Jeff pointed his finger at me. He goes, "So the message here, Scott, is test everything." And what I love about that story is how we design shoes and make shoes in 2023, vastly different from what 1978, 79. So you just can't really tell a designer, "Hey, we used to do this." It's academic. It's kind of interesting if you're into it, but the test everything message is absolutely as relevant today as it was, in 70 and 78. And so those are the things that when we try to tell when we tell stories within DNA to the company, to the employees, we always put the litmus test on why does this matter, right? What can be gained? How can we instruct or inspire a 27-year-old designer or 25-year-old marketing person who's just joined the company with a story that resonates with them today, but it's drawn from our past. So it has that double whammy of characters they've heard of, or actors or athletes or people, but it's a relevant story that can help them with their job today. And that's the sweet spot, right? Those are the stories that really have an impact, as opposed to just your grandpa saying, candy bars used to be 15 cents. Like, great, grandpa, they're $1.50 now. So what am I going to do with this information?
It's funny. I can't remember where I read this, but Nike is a 50-year-old brand, and if you think about a 50-year-old person trying to tell a 20-year-old person how they should live their life or what product is cool, and you sort of anthropomorphize this idea, people don't want to take those types of stories to heart unless it can be relatable, unless there's some kind of universal truth in that. And so, to your credit and the credit of Nike, I think that brand has just done a brilliant job of innovating and remaining relevant and making those historical moments matter. My last question for you today, thank you, is what's next for you? This is now to next. You've got the beauty of retirement ahead of you. What do you want to do with yourself?
Well, I'm looking more forward to retirement once my wife decides she's ready to hang up her cleats. She also works at Nike, and she likes what she does, so she hasn't decided on her end date as well. So, I'm looking forward to more travel and doing things with her. We have a son lives in Los Angeles. We'd like to go see him more often. And, so that's probably from just a larger retirement stamp. But I'm also getting some inquiries from different groups. Can't talk about them, but not Nike, not in the industry per se, but there are other companies, other couple sports franchises who are interested in getting their own archive, or so I'm potentially going to do some consulting there to help them with my years of wisdom. And so I don't know. I'm 62, right? So I'm hopefully got a few years left in the tank. But I don't. I just was tired of the bureaucracy. We talked about this before we went on the air, and it's just for me, it was the lack of, or I was no longer really able to do the interviewing anymore. No longer able to do the writing and the fun stuff, right? I was doing the bureaucratic stuff and managing the 7 people who were getting to do all the fun stuff. And so for me, I was like, nah, I'm ready to tank. I'm ready to hand the reins over and let somebody else do this.
Well, when you're ready to write Shoe Dog 2, I'm ready to read it. So we're going to look forward to that. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really, really appreciate your time and appreciate the insights and the stories. And thank you, everybody, for joining in. We'll catch you next time.